Hi, everybody. You're all so welcome. So just put in the chat where you're from. It'd be nice to hear where you're from. So we've South Dakota, North Carolina, Dublin. Oh, Ireland originally, West Cornwall, Melbourne, but staying in Yorkshire. Lovely. Acton West in London, Berlin, West Cork. Lovely. So it's so lovely to welcome you here. This is our first ever online Mount Haemus, and it's my first Mount Haemus day or evening to attend myself. We started in 2000. The first Mount Haemus scholar had their paper published in 2000, and now this is 2024. And we've just produced our third volume of the Mount Haemus lectures, which are available in the shop, the orders shop. But it is so lovely to be able to attend this Mount Haemus online. And we have 4 speakers from the US. So 2 this evening and 2 next Tuesday. So hopefully you can all come back and listen to them as well. And then we will have, because we didn't have our Mount Haemus Day in 2020, that was meant to be part of the installation ceremony where we're going to have a Mount Haemus Day. And for COVID reasons, we had to postpone it. So so it's nice to be doing it this year. This is the 60th anniversary of the order. So it's nice to be able to mark it with our online Mount Haemus days. So I think we have 67. I think maybe I will introduce this evening. The first speaker today is Michelle Lafrance, and she is in a lovely named place. We were talking about it earlier, Lost River, West Virginia. And she was, she is going, her title, hers is the 22nd Mount Haemus lecture, and it's entitled The Feminist Druid, Making Way for New Stories, New Work. Now, the format is, there's a 40-minute presentation, so that includes Q&A, so you can put 40 minutes. Then we will have a breakout session, and that's just for social engagement. You'll be randomly assigned. That's what we'll be doing when we meet in person. We'll be having breaks in between the speakers. So again, it's a bit of a social evening as well. So over to you, Michelle.
Thank you so much, Amy. And thank you all for joining us today. I actually would like to share my screen if I could. It looks like screen sharing is not enabled. Wonderful. Now, as Amer has said, my talk is called The Feminist Druid, Making Way for New Stories and New Work. I'm hoping everyone can hear me just fine. Please make a signal if indeed you cannot hear me. Now, this talk that I put together celebrates the women who have volunteered, staffed, organized, taught, posted, crafted, advocated, right? Offered their visions for this spirited tradition over the many years of its remaking, recognizing the role of women in Druid history and the contributions of women to modern Druidry. I offered my original talk in triadic form, focusing on the radical origins of revivalist Druidry and the contributions of women to 20th century Druid workings, women working in 21st century contexts, and the sensibilities encoded into today's Druidry. My goal was to imagine an even more overtly feminist future. The background for, of course, that work were a series of folk tales that I found in archives that I thought embodied the many sensibilities, traditions of work, conceptualizations and theories that have driven the types of feminist work that I do as a scholar at George Mason University, where I work as a professor of public rhetoric with graduate students who will teach writing and rhetoric around the US, both in high school contexts and in college contexts. So, I wanted to really focus in on something that was very valuable to me and to my own personal and professional history. This idea that what we might be doing as Druids was already overtly feminist, and to call us to embrace those values and sensibilities and to work towards an even more feminist future. of course, what I have to do when I set out to enact a project like that is to define what I mean by feminism. And that, of course, is going to be an incredible challenge for anyone, right? Because we have 300 years of history, feminist history to draw on. And some would even place the origins of feminist thought further into history than just the last 300 years. We might think as well about the critique of universalized human experience as a component of feminist work, how feminism focuses on the historical marginalization of people, women of color, LGBT, LGBTQ people, and the differently abled. And also, we might think about how our ideas, social patterns, and norms are filtered through and inflected by patriarchal expectations as we're defining feminism. But I think as we begin to look at the lessons that these folk tales offer us, we see that feminism today also offers us something deeper, more eco-spiritual in its orientation, and about our relationships in really dramatic and interesting ways, right? And so we're moving in, some people might call it a fourth, fifth, or sixth wave of feminist work. And I think Druidry is part and parcel of that sort of worldwide awakening around our relationships, our understandings of who we are, what we do, and why that matters so much in 21st century contexts. So now the three folk tales that I focused on in this original paper were the Seal Wife, and you might know that story as an Orkney folktale about a silky woman and a man who becomes her husband and raises a family with her. And that folktale really focuses in on, I think, the ideals of reciprocity and spiritual eco work. I also focus on cat cracker nuts, right? And the ethos of care and our work, right? And the final folktale I focus on is The King and the Foal, with the idea that the personal is truly political in a sort of historical way, but also in really interesting ways that we can continue to think about within these 21st century contexts. Now, my goal today is not to read these stories or to tell these stories to you, or even necessarily to read my paper verbatim to you, but to read a few of the chunks that I think really carry forward some of the most important points that I make within this essay and the talk I will give today, but also to bring forward a few points of opportunity and clarification that can continue this conversation today as we break out into groups, as we think about how we carry a conversation like this forward within the context of the work that we do within the everyday. So I will start today with the lessons and opportunities presented by the Seal Wife, right? Now, originally I had really focused in on the notion of consent culture as part of the story, right, of the Seal Wife. Now, and the Seal Wife, and I've already sketched some of this, right? A man finds a silky, bathing on a stone. He steals her skin. He hides the skin, which binds her to him. They marry, they have children, but she's always drawn back to the sea. And then one day, one of her children lets her know that the skin is hidden in the roof of their cottage. And she's able to get that skin, reclaim that skin, and return to the sea without a look back, right? Now, in my original essay, I discuss how this is an example of consent culture, right? That we must live in respectful relationship with the world and its many beings. We must live in a respectful relationship with nature and the supernatural. But today I want to push that just a little bit towards thinking about how transactionality often attends many of our spiritual beliefs and practices, and how we can push that towards a bit more reciprocity and co-creation. So allow me if I will, and apologies, I'm on my iPad, so now I need to catch up with myself by scrolling forward. And I'm almost there. Thank you for bearing with me. What I want to say today is that this tale clearly emphasizes the power dynamics between men, women, humankind, and wild creatures, but it also foregrounds the mistaken belief that mankind has dominion over the natural world, and it echoes with the messages of today's consent culture and the feminist principle of reciprocity. The good man of Wasteness holds the silky woman against her will, gains her children in the work of her hands and emotions because of his theft of her skin. And I don't need to belabor the message that this is not a right relationship at all with the natural world or underlying the lessons of Feminism 101 conveyed. All people must have freedom to make choices, even bad or unpopular choices, and they must be offered mutual respect. I think that kind of goes unspoken in today's Druid community. We cannot simply take from the natural world. We must also see ourselves in respectful relation to it. And that brings me to this notion of transactionality and moving towards, right, reciprocity as a way of working instead. I draw here from Irene Glass and a blog that she wrote and posted recently on the Glass Witch Cottage, which is a phenomenal blog. If you're not following Irene Glass's work, I love to offer a shout out to her because she's smart, always on point, and very thoughtful about current events in pagan communities. What she points out is that our home and the land that we live on, we can consider it what she calls a spiritual polyculture, right? All of the beings that live there currently have lived there, have essentially built what she describes as a spiritual ecosystem, right? And what we're doing instead of simply transacting with the beings, with the others in our world, human and non-human, seen and unseen, is finding our place within these existing ecosystems, right? As opposed to demanding a place or really overtly making a place, right? We are cultivating a healthy balance with the spiritual polyculture already present, right? And that takes time, that takes attention, and that takes intention. So our goal here, I think, and again, I see Druids doing this all of the time, and much of the work that they do and the writings that they produce, right, is building this notion of reciprocity, right? That our relationships reflect our deep respect for others and our deep interest in healthy, balanced, and spiritual relationship. Now, the second folktale that I covered, Kate Crackernuts, has always been one of my favorites. And originally, I discussed it in terms of an ethos of care, right? Kate is self-actualizing, problem-solving, courageous. She uses a great deal of discernment to solve those problems, right? She works through mindfulness and relationship as she solves the problems that she is situated within. In that story, Kate and her sister, who is also named Kate, are essentially driven from their homes. The sister Kate, not the main character Kate, is stricken by a stepmother with the head of a sheep, right? And so she's walking through life with the head of a sheep. And Kate solves that problem and the problem of the household that they end up living in for quite a while by problem solving, right? So she follows a young prince who is afflicted by a fairy curse into a fairy mound. She distracts the guards who are watching that young prince by rolling hazelnuts that she's collected and tucked into a pocket, right, across the floor. And through the course of 3 visits to that fairy hill, she finds a magic bird, which she brings back into the material realm. She makes a soup of that bird, which then cures the young prince and her sister both, right? And they are able to essentially marry and have full lives because of her self-actualization, problem-solving, courageousness, her discernment, and her care for others. Now, obviously, right in that original essay, I've spoken to how mindfulness and relationship guide our work as Druids, but I also really want to underscore a point with this in this original essay that we still have so much more work to do as active relational folks in our world today. Now, here's where I'll read a passage from this essay, because I'd like to note that Druidry, for many, offers a type of very personal, very balanced activist sensibility. We walk softly on the world. We think of ourselves in relationship with the world, with the land that we live on, with the resources that we use in the everyday, with our relationships with others. And this is not really, even as history and some of the values that surround Druidry have changed, this is not really a new ethos at all. In fact, if we look back at the original work of Iolo Morgannwg, we see, while he was not necessarily a supporter of the feminist cause by any means, right? His political and literary associations brought him into close contact with many of the figures of early feminism. We can't say that these figures, of course, directly influenced Morgannwg's Druidic tracts, but they were visible and vocal within the communities where he circulated within his era. So their indirect influence is altogether likely. And this is an era of great political and social change, much as our own. During his tenure in London, Morgannwg attended social gatherings hosted by Elizabeth Stuart Bowdler, a writer, and her daughter, Henrietta Maria Bowdler, a literary editor. He visited the salons of Elizabeth Montagu, a British social reformer, patron of London artists, a literary critic, and organizer of the Blue Stocking Society. Montagu was known as the Queen of the Blue Stockings. I love that. I would love to be called a Queen of the Blue Stockings. Morgannwg likewise moved in literary circles with the Wollstonecrafts, including Mary Wollstonecraft, who published A Vindication of the Rights of Women in 1792. He also admired and took some inspiration from the writings of Anne Letitia Bardell, whose poetry, essays, and social criticisms aroused public consciousness against war and slavery. It is altogether likely that feminist tracts passed through Morgannwg's hands as well. He was a bookseller and a voracious reader of political writing. Morgannwg was well informed about the social experiments of the area, many of which highlighted inequality between the sexes, if not free love, and a return to living close to the land, particularly the experiments of the Quakers in the British Isles and the US, where scholars root many early strains of the feminist movement. Our understandings of radicalism have expanded quite a bit since Morgannwg's day. Many of today's Druids, animists, and eco-activists now hold, right? For instance, that trees, rivers, and animals are non-human persons. Many of us would argue that nature itself has inalienable rights. So it's not too far stretched to imagine that Morgannwg's thoughts on women may have advanced to reflect our era's ideals as well. Now, the feminist influence on Druidry then comes into yet clearer focus when we recognize the more direct work of women Philip Gargong has made the founding mothers of Druidry. Among those foremothers, the two most recognized are Vera Chapman and Doreen Valentine. Knoll's online bibliography of Chapman notes that she is best known as the founder of the Tolkien Society of Great Britain, an accomplished author herself, having written the Arthurian trilogy, The Green Knight, The King Arthur's Daughter, and The King's Damsels. She met Ross Nichols through their mutual involvement in the ancient Druid order and served as the Pendragon of the Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids, founded by Nichols in 1965. Like Morgannwg, Chapman believed in social reform and economic justice, though she chose not to focus her energies on overt political action. Valentine might be held by many to be the mother of modern paganism, and she is often recognized for her poetic and moving Charge of the Goddess, a witch's liturgical text that popularized what is now a well-integrated eco-feminist ethos in pagan circles. Shortly after the 1952 repeal of the British Witchcraft Act, Valentine was introduced to Gerald Gardner, became the high priestess of the New Forest Coven, and collaborated extensively with Gardner to update his Book of Shadows, right? And I could go on and on, right? Now, Gargong then emphasizes the influences of these two founding mothers on 20th century paganism, but particularly the influence of Vera Chapman upon new Druidry. Chapman drew on noteworthy academic credentials that rivaled Nichols' own, as well as a similarly deep affinity for history and poetry. She maintained her friendship with Nichols and held the position of Pendragon until 1991, 17 years after Nichols' death. It was Chapman who gave Carcon the draft manuscript that became the Book of Druidry and other documents that yet inform Obod's liturgies and philosophies today. And of course, I could go on, but in the interest of time, I will move forward and think about um, our opportunities here as we move forward. Now, I have focused on feminism and feminism today, but I have to really note a deep debt to many of the queer theorists and many of my friends and relations here in the US who identify as queer or trans, right? The gift that they have given me is this notion of a sort of sovereignty, right, of personhood. And so I wanted to turn us just very briefly in a sort of messy way to thinking about the ways that queer theorists have really pushed against some of the ways that we have inherited structures of thought around nature, right? Now, here's this wonderful quotation from David Griffiths from a fantastic essay that you can find online called Queer Theory for Lichen, where essentially Griffiths is arguing that nature can be interpreted through these lenses of heteronormativity, and that inadvertently justifies, explains, right, or maintains a sort of conservative and normative status quo, right? Now, if our goal is to imagine an even more overtly feminist or even queer future, right, we want to be thinking about how we can work against these traditions, right, these norms and dominations that we've inherited. So here is Griffith writing, right, that we want to question narratives that brand some bodies, communities, and practices, right, in ways that marginalize them. This is important politically, he says, because sometimes normalization is masquerading as nature, right, and that necessarily supports the conservative status quo and can be hostile to non-normativity. So, as I catch up with myself one more time, one of the things we might begin to consider then is how we can continue to think about the inheritances that we have in today's contexts, the ways we conceive of nature, how those understandings can be more flexible, more fluid, right, and more dynamic, whether or not, in fact, we're perhaps imposing some of our human understandings on a world that isn't necessarily defined as human in and of itself. Now that brings us to the third story that I focused on, which is The King and the Fool. Now, in my original essay, I focused on that story as a demonstration of the personal and the political. And I focused a good deal on how power within and around us and within individuals or within our public roles can also be a component of what we do when we think about let me rephrase that. We can be thinking about individual power and the power of our public roles as Druids in ways that we are participating, right? We are remaking, we are reimagining those roles to some degree. My point here, right, and the thing that I would like to really focus on today is that we participate in the political, whether we call ourselves activists or not, right? And I think that's a really important point in today's 21st century context because so many of our political structures, our material structures, our economic structures are under a good deal of pressure. When we begin to think about our spiritual lives as absolutely inseparable from the world around us, then when we begin to understand that this personal work is also political work and it's work that we do in relation with others, I believe we're stepping into an overtly feminist or deeply even humanist space. We are really thinking about the potential of humanity, the ways that our histories might limit us, right? But also the opportunities ahead of us for equality and for justice work. And I would like to end here with this a small passage from this fantastic essay that appeared last fall in the New York Times by Robin Wall Kimmerer, who is just one of my favorite authors. She is an Indigenous author. You probably are familiar with her book, Braiding Sweetgrass. In this essay, the turtle mothers have come to ask about an unpaid debt. Kimmerer discusses the return of turtle mothers to a place where she has been attending summer camps and other activities over the last few years. And she's noting the way that the stresses on that ecosystem the turtles exist within those stresses are changing where turtles lay eggs, where turtles appear on the property, and the interactions that the turtles have with the humans upon that property. And she writes, we need more than policy change. We need change in worldview, from the fiction of human exceptionalism to the reality of our kinship and reciprocity in the living world. The earth asks that we renounce a culture of endless taking so that the world can continue. It is no longer a matter of small acts of stewardship, not enough to tenderly move the eggs from one place to another when there are no more places for them to go, not enough to write praise songs for turtles, not enough to study the hormones that change the sex of the turtle eggs when the temperature rises. And so in my original essay, I didn't actually offer a conclusion. I asked us to pause and I offered an invitation, right? That we continue to think about the stories that we share and tell and their power, that we continue to think about the power of stories to remake the world, to build relationships and understanding, and to find new places to stand, that indeed we begin to tell new stories and build new sets of relations that can sustain us, that can fuel us, whether we identify overtly as feminist, overtly as activist or not, and that have the potential to really help us rethink who we are and how we live in ways that I think are deeply important for this current historical moment. And I welcome conversation with all of you about those stories and the ways that we can reimagine who we are and what we do together. Thanks so much for your time and your attention. It's been a real pleasure. Please do email me if you would like. You can see my email here. You can also find it in the Feminist Druid Making Way for New Stories on the OBOD Mount Haemus website. Thank you.
Wow, Michelle, thank you so, so much. Now, I don't see any questions in the chat. So if anyone, just to use the little hands up sign icon, if anyone wants a question. You mentioned, your concluding remarks about the power of story. And as a storyteller, I'm always fascinated. And you talk about new stories. Have you any, I'm not asking you to tell it now, but do you have any new stories or any inspiration for new stories that can be for us in these times?
Sure. Wow. I mean, there's so many of them. I think I have let me think. Let me think on that. I do. I'm suddenly having so many different racing thoughts. I do want to say there are a couple of authors who I've really turned to lately, and their stories are very personal, but also very much about living in today's world. And Sharon Blackie's work is someone I would really turn people to. She has a phenomenal book called Haggitude, which is all about becoming, an older woman in a world under enormous pressure, but also living as ourselves, finding ourselves in this world, right? In a sort of graceful relationship with the natural world, but also the people that we share the world with and our closest relations, our family and our friends. And so I think Sharon Blackie's work is a fantastic model for this sort of storytelling. She also delves into a number of archival folktales, right, and talks about the stories of place and space in ways that I think are incredibly moving as she relates to them. And so I'll leave with Sharon Blackie, and I'll continue to think about whether other stories I would offer, because there's so many. It's hard for me to choose Yeah, in the moment.
Thank you. Thank you, Michelle. Are there any other questions? I haven't been fed any yet. So, Philip, do you have anything to ask?
I'll unmute. I'll unmute here. Thank you so much. That was great, Michelle. That was lovely to hear. And I suppose I don't know whether you have time. This may be too big a question to elucidate now, but I always find it hard to grasp queer theory. And great that you brought it in. Is there a way you can explain it to people who aren't familiar with it that is kind of weak, so we can get it?
Absolutely. It was recently described to me as an intervention into norms and gender roles, right, around gender and sexuality, right? Moving away from a sort of binary thinking into a recognition of the sort of charismatic experience of humankind. Now, for some, that is about sexuality and expressions of sexuality. For some, that is more about identity and perhaps non-sexual relationships, right? But it is a sort of radical re-understanding of how gender relates, right, to a sort of human experience.
Can I just tell you, what did you say? Paris? You used a word that I
Oh,
didn't
yeah,
understand.
charismatic, right? So in a continuum or a prism, right,
I
is
like it.
what,
Like it.
yeah,
Okay, yeah, that's
yeah,
a
right?
lovely word. Yeah. Okay. I mean, I think one way I relate to it, I is a way that in esoteric tradition and in Druidry and even in Jungian thought, and astrology, and there's a way in which, for instance, natural elements are gendered. So that water is feminine and fire is masculine and all the rest of it, and numbers. In the numerology, the idea that odd numbers are feminine and even numbers are masculine or vice versa. I can't remember. And it just occurred to me that this is really nonsensical at one level. That maybe it's not so helpful to think in those terms. So I wrote a piece about, is it time to stop the gender allocations to? So I can see how this call to go beyond binary thinking can be really helpful in just opening our minds in that way. So thank you for explaining it. I attended a lecture recently in Lewis, in our hometown, where they're on a project to queer the river, our local river. And I was sitting there thinking, how can we queer a river? What does this mean? Because she didn't explain the context. But thank you. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Thanks, Philip. There's a question from Liz Hills. Have you given any thought to reworking more problematic stories in the lore? She gives the example of the story of Medusa, and recent scholarship about it comes to mind.
Sure. Yeah, I've seen some people do some really interesting things in remaking these stories. And we can see these in popular literature all over the place, right? The story of Circe is a really good example, recognizing how Circe sort of moves from marginalized victim into sort of powerful character. We see this even in something like Wicked, right? Rethinking the archetype of the witch, right? So people have been, writers and thinkers have been very, very active in remaking these stories. I think we can continue to do far more work here. Right? We can think about what it means to have stories that are not just bound by sort of traditional notions of gender, but really remake those notions, right, in interesting ways. And so we have queer writers and feminist writers doing this work. And again, there's so many that I could list. So I'm thinking immediately of that book, Circe. I'm thinking of something like Wicked, and then there are just dozens of other examples, even retellings of things like Jane Austen's work, right, which I think are phenomenal, delightful, right, in their sort of historical play, but also really begin to point us the way to thinking about the way we can find a more generous way to live with one another, right?
Thank you. We've got just two more questions. That's probably what we'll just have enough time for that.
Yeah.
Wait a second now. This is from Claire James. Do you think Chapman's work is advocated loudly enough? Did you say Chapman provided the manuscript for the Book of Druidry? Was that under her name?
I'm going to hand that to Philip, as I believe I pulled that from one of your writings.
Yeah, that's right. Incidentally, a little detail, it's Valiente, Doreen Valiente, Michelle, not Valentine. Just to correct that. Chapman, yes, no, the manuscript was written by Nguyen, and she had it in her possession. So that was right. And as regards whether her work is advocated loud enough, that's an interesting question. That's maybe something to be taken up. It'd be nice to see a reprinting of her feminist Arthurian stories. And Ema, did you notice the question above Fiona Mulholland's is it Bluss Salt Road by Joanne Harris?
I think she must mean The Blue Salt Road by Joanne Harris is also a wonderful Selkie story, but the gender roles are flippant and she writes beautifully. I've just noted that. And then Therese says, I think the Wren and the Eagle story needs a rewriting. They're not in competition, but in reciprocity. Yin and Yang are yin yang, not either or. And I like that notion of both and as opposed to either or. And often, you know, in discourse, it's either you are or you aren't. And it's like, well, no, you can be both and. And I think it's a nice way to avoid the duality of, because duality is interesting, but it also gets us into polarity and then conflict. Pat has, this is the last question. Could Michelle say a little more about how the role of, for example, rivers and mountains as non-human persons fits into her feminist and queer theory framework?
Sure. I mean, that's a whole conversation right there, right? I mean, I think if we are really working against this notion of mankind's dominion over nature, that one of the wonderful, generous things that we can do is begin to recognize where we have historically, I think because of separations like mind-body dualism, removed an understanding of intelligence or consciousness, right, in the material world, thinking of some entities as a sort of simply a dead material or, right, a material without agentive potential even. And so for me, in trying to think with feminist concepts, I'm trying to think in non-hierarchical ways. And that's where I begin to think then, okay, right? What if, right? And not only what if, but I feel something speaking back to me. I feel a presence here. And what could that be? Now, I can't offer an answer, right, that's definitive in any sort of way about what that presence might be. It is not necessarily my role to define it, but a non-human personhood means that there's a sort of agency there. There's a right that we can grant, right, to autonomy, to sovereignty. And especially as we begin to think about the natural world, right, and how we move forward in terms of policy making or reconceiving who we are and what we do, it would be wonderful to think about how things like rivers and mountains are not only non-human persons, but they have rights to exist, right? And that changes the nature of our relationship with them. And so that's just an initial, very, very messy, off the cuff sort of response. I know that there are a number of writers working in these issues. Gary Snyder is someone I can think of right off the top of my head. And if people email me, I'm certain I can come up with a good list of other folks as well if I sit down or look through my library. And so thank you for those wonderful questions.
That is absolutely wonderful. So now is the time for a little get together. You can talk about whatever you like, where you come from, what you're doing in the order, or any comments about Michelle's talk. So I'm going to randomly assign you, and we have, oh, we're actually, you know what, Michelle, we've finished on the button. I'm very impressed. So we have 30 minutes to chat. So let's get talking. So just click on the, if you're new to Zoom, just click on the number that you're assigned. Now I must, how do I pause this? Just before I assign people. Wow, I don't know how to do that now. Oh, I can see, sorry, it's
Brilliant.
So welcome back, everybody. I hope you enjoyed your chats in your breakout rooms. So this brings us to part 2, and where Roma Johnson, who is in the library in Princeton, and hers is the 21st lecture, Mount Haemus lecture, and her title is The Well and the Chapel, Confluence. So, and I know, Roma, you're going to, for those of you who have, if you read this, it's a very different format to what's on the website. I'll hand that over to you, Roma. So over to you.
Okay, over to me. What's happening is that on the website, the paper is formatted as it was written, which is I have a lot of poetry, and the poetry and the text kind of go along with each other. In the published work, a lot of the poetry has been deconstructed and looks like run-on sentences. Bit disconcerting. If anybody wants to see the original, you can either go on my website or go on the OBOD website and see the original. But the words are there, but a little odd. All right. Are we ready to go?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Fabulous. Well, I wrote this paper during the first few months of COVID because I was just I was thinking a lot about Druidry and Christianity, and did they have to be a choice? I mean, if you were a Druid, could you just not be a Christian? And if you were a Christian, could you just not admit you were a Druid? And where was that? And what was that? And so I started looking into just exploring the depth and synergy between the two, between Druidry and Christianity. And I used the well and the chapel as lenses that we could look through. So I call it the origin story or the worldview of Druidry as coming from the well, and I call Christianity as coming from the chapel. And I just used them as ways of talking about it, so I don't have to explain every time where I'm going. Okay. And I wrote this as a thought problem. I wrote it for me, really, as a faith problem and a thought problem to try to see where they connected or where they didn't connect, where there were parallel lines, where there were barricades, where there was ultimately confluence between the two. And so I think it might be well, I'll tell you, first of all, when I teach a lot in different settings. So when I teach this in a Christian setting, I get a lot of pushback about, oh, Druids, what's that? You know, like tree huggers, woo-woo, you know, fairy, toodle-doo, all that sort of thing. And then as I'm walking out to the parking lot after the lecture, almost invariably somebody comes up to me and says, you know, I've always wondered if maybe I was a witch. And if I teach in the opposite, if I teach to the Druids and teach this you know, Celtic spirituality and maybe what is Druidry, what is Christianity, I get a lot of pushback about Christianity, dogma, religion, bah humbug, my ruined childhood, etc. Fine and dandy. But I will say that when I'm walking out down the hall, I'd have had people come up to me and say, you know, I'm a Druid, but I've always just really liked, you know, some of the things about Christianity. So somewhere in here we got messed up in thinking that we had to be either one or the other. And that's the genesis of this paper. I don't know. Well, anyway, that's the genesis of the paper. So I went back to what I call the worldview. And so since I wrote the paper, I no longer think of it so much as worldview as an origin story. I go back to the origin story. Where does some of this come from? And so before I do that, before I start down that path, I would just like for you to join me in just creating in your own mind these two lenses. So if you don't have to close your eyes, but if you want to, if you could just close your eyes for a minute and just leave where you are and walk out. and find yourself on a path that winds around and around and down and around and down and around and down and around and on. And eventually you come to a place where, by standing in the middle of the road, on the one hand, you see an old chapel, an old stone chapel from way back when. And on the other side, you see a grove with perhaps around a sacred well with trees and flowers. And those are the two images that I want you to hold in your mind as we go through this, so that when I say chapel, you see this old chapel, and when I say well, you find yourself there. I think it'll just help you get through some of this talk. All right, so I'll give you an example. I'll give you an example in poetry of how I see these two points of view. So I'll read you two short poems. The first one is called The Chapel, and it goes like this. A little aside from the main road, becalmed in a last century grayness, there is a chapel, ugly, without the appeal to the tourist to stop his car and visit it. The traffic goes by and the river goes by, and quick shadows of clouds too, and the chapel settles a little deeper into the grass. But here, once on an evening like this, in the darkness that was about his hearers, a preacher caught fire. A preacher caught fire and burned steadily before them with a strange light. So they saw about them and sang their amens, fiercely, narrow, but saved in a way that men are not now. Isn't that lovely? Horace Thomas, beautiful. And now I'll read you one that'll just sort of hopefully evoke the well. And this is called The Creel. The world began with a woman, shawl-happed, stooped under a creel, whose slow step you recognize from troubled dreams. You feel obliged to help her bear her burden from hill or kelp-strewn shore, but she passes by unseeing, furled to her private shore. She passes by unseeing, furled to her private shore. It's not seabirds or peat she's carrying, or fleece, nor herring bright, but her fear that if ever she put it down, the world would go out like a light. Isn't that marvelous? The creel. So you see those two voices, the chapel and the well, in those poems. So starting with origins or worldviews, I think if we go back to time way past, and we think about the well and the chapel, we think about two ways of being in the world. And one of the ways is immanence, I-M-M-A-N-E-N-C, immanence, and the other is immanence with an I. And immanence is that everything in the world is God. God is in everything in the world. Everything in the world has sentience. Everything in the world is part of the creation, and it's all part of Godness. And immanence is that God is somewhat extrinsic or away from this, but the kingdom of God is imminent, is coming. It's not quite here. We're not quite perfect enough. We're not quite there yet. It's imminent. So we balance those two points of view, immanence and imminence, when we look at these origin stories. If you look at an origin story from immanence or the well, we see a woman standing maybe in the seagrass on a cliff overlooking the ocean. and we see the seabirds, and we see the wind, and we see God in all things. And this woman lives in a world with no roads and no cities, and a world of earth, sea, and sky. And wisdom is intrinsic, and it's in everything. There's wisdom in the stones, there's wisdom in the trees, there's wisdom in the water. And it's very, very rooted in place. Where you are at this moment, this place is sacred, right? And trouble comes when things get out of balance. Immanence, to be a good and happy place, it has to be in balance. So trouble comes when things in the natural world get out of balance. Okay. Now, if we go to the chapel side and we think about the origin story there, we might see a young man walking barefoot in the desert in a little town that's under Roman rule, where there's poverty, oppression, violence, slavery, where the belief is that humans are in a covenantal relationship with the Creator God, and that God speaks directly to humans through history. So God spoke in the past, God spoke through Torah, God speaks now. God cannot be approached directly. God approaches the other way. And wisdom is extrinsic. It comes from the outside. It's mediated by priests, it's mediated in the liturgy. Many of the people are illiterate, and it's rooted in time. It's rooted in the time. Where are we on this long history? Back to Moses, say, or then back through Abraham, and then maybe on to this and on to that. And God is imminent. I'm going to screw myself up. Imminent, but not immanent. And the role of humankind is to stay in covenant relationship with God. And things get bad or trouble comes when that covenant is not respected or followed. So that humans become out of relationship with God. You see the differences, a very different worldview between immanence and imminence. Okay, like in the well, caring for nature and caring for living things and relating to all life is just the way it is. In the chapel side, you hear things like, I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. I was naked and you gave me clothing. I was sick and you took care of me. You hear that in order to be in right relationship with God, you do these things with your fellow humans. And trouble comes when the relationship is somehow broken. And sometimes when the relationship is broken, it's called wickedness, or something happens because you didn't take care of the widows and orphans, etc. Different points of view, immanence and imminence. So there was a historian, theologian, who was actually from Ireland, Amar, who came from Ireland and went to Rome, and he fought against this idea, this nascent idea that that you were out of relationship with God the minute you were born, this original sin kind of an idea. And he went to Rome, and you can hear that he's one of these through lines, because he writes, when God pronounced that his creation was good, it was not only that his hand had fashioned every creature, it was that his breath brought every creature to life. The presence of God's Spirit in all living things is what makes them beautiful. And if we look with God's eyes, nothing is ugly. So you hear him coming from the other side. And not to make a joke of it, but he was, of course, immediately branded a heretic and sent away because he just could not fit with the way things were supposed to be. So that's kind of the setup. That's the setup of how things are and how things have to be, and how justice is meted out, and how humans, and wherever they are supposed to relate to this and bring restoration. It's very different on the chapel in the early days, and it has been like this ever since, between one side and the other, between the well and the chapel. And then I talk about the three. And the three is where things start to get a little bit closer together, because the three is a sacred number in both. And in lots of religions have a sacred number as three. And for instance, in Druidry, we have the triads, we have the three foundations of spirituality. Philip knows this one: hearth as altar, work as worship, service as sacrament. That's a triad. I have one that I think is even more wonderful, because it seems again to bring in both worlds. Three slender threads on which the world swings. The thin stream of milk from the cow's udder, the thin stalk from which corn springs forth, and the thin string of grace by which God holds us up. There's a crossover for you. There's a crossover for you. So I want to talk a little bit about adaptations that do not appear as straight through lines, and rather are seen more interwoven and interpenetrating. For instance, if you just, this will be a quiz later for you to tell me which is this a well or is this a chapel, okay? The wild goose is the Holy Spirit, is Awen. The life cycle of the oak is inherent in the cross and the resurrection. The baptismal river feeds and is fed by the well. The cauldron of wisdom is the chalice of the holy feast. The shelter of the sacred grove and the sanctuary of the chapel mirror each other. Bridget and Mary meet, midwife and mother to the divine child. The wheel of life and the mystery of rebirth turn and turn in eternity. In all, not as separate paths, but as strands unfolding in a single pattern. So, to go on with the three, we have the triple goddess, right? We have the goddess of sovereignty, the goddess of the earth mother, and the goddess of the hag of wisdom. And they're sisters, and they're constantly interchanging, and they're manifestations, one could say, manifestations of the goddess, the greater goddess, who manifests as this when this is needed, and as this when this is needed, and when this, and takes on these different, not personas exactly, but sacred personas, you might call them, as is needed for any situation. And the movement between them is always interesting because it brings about change. If you go from death to life, or from a fertile to barren, or this sort of thing, it's constantly in motion. And that's the nature of the triple goddess. Whereas you have in the chapel, you have the Trinity, right? You have God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. But these are not three entities interchanging with one another. In Christianity, these are thought as one and inseparable, one being three in one, so to speak. So it's a slightly different way of thinking about this, the threeness of things. Is that crossing over? I don't know. I mean, it would be interesting to sit down and talk that out for a long time. I talk in the paper about the soul's journey, and I talk about the different ways of perceiving the soul's journey. And it's hard for me, even as I was writing this, it was hard for me to figure out what category do they fit in. My categories started falling apart, as you can probably tell, which was where we get to ultimately to confluence. But at the time, I was trying to put them in A or B. And I came to the soul's journey. Now, in the early Christian times in Ireland, especially Scotland, Ireland, and Wales, one of the ways that the soul journey took place was, in actuality, the monks would get in a little boat, a little calfskin boat, and they would push off to sea, not just push off to sea and let the tides and the ocean take them where they were supposed to be. It was an absolute negation of individuality. It was putting oneself in the hands of God, and God would take you where you were supposed to be. It was called peregrini, or journeyers pro amore Dei, journeying for the love of God. And Jeffrey Morehouse writes a wonderful book about this, and he talks about when they get to the end of the river, just where the river's turning into the sea. He says, when you reach the sea, the moment the waves begin, there you must surrender to what will be and wait for the sign. Wherever the boat begins to lead, the way you must go from then on. Wherever the boat begins to lead, that's the way you must go from then on. It will be meant. It will be meant. And so this total surrender, I often meet with groups and ask anybody to raise their hand if they'd be willing to do something like that. Get in a boat not knowing where they're going and see where they are meant. And on the other side of it all, you have the quest, like the hero's quest, or the quest that has a purpose. And usually when you go on a quest, you're questing for something, or to get something, or to go somewhere. And so the destination is known, as opposed to the peregrination, where the destination is unknown. But very different ways of looking at this need for us to journey in our souls, journey in our imagination, and to journey to find God. So I have another poem for you that is called The Owl Woman. And she says, how shall I begin my song in the blue night that is settling? In the great night, my heart will go out toward me, the darkness comes rattling. In the great night, my heart will go out toward me, the darkness comes rattling. In the great night, my heart will go out. Brown owls come here in the blue evening. They are hooting about. They are shaking their wings and hooting. Black butte is far. Below it, I had my dawn. I could see the daylight coming back for me. The morning star is up. I cross the mountains into the light of the sea. Lovely story. The owls hooting. I love that. Okay. So that was another section in the paper. And then I ultimately come to where I begin to see that this is all kind of one thing. This is not a binary. This is not two different things. It's two different lenses. And that if we look, we can start to see confluence, and we can start to build confluence. And I meditated on this for hours and weeks and months, trying to envision two beautiful rivers coming together into one transformational, transcendent flow. And I named this confluence. So I thought this takes the choice out. This takes the either or out. This takes the binary out, this confluence. I saw a confluence in our nostalgia for earth, sea, and sky, and our longing for a new heaven on earth. I saw confluence in the creation affirming immanence of the well and the spiritualized immanence of the chapel. I saw confluence of our shared responsibility for balance and for right relationship. I saw confluence of our visions of peace and a restored earth. I saw confluence in co-creation through faith and action. And I know, I'm not naive. I know that people now think that the church is over. It's gone. It's of no use whatsoever. The church is over and the earth is degraded. So there's no hope, right? But I don't feel that way. I feel like we can start to envision a changed world of confluence where we work together, where we don't have to make choices between one and the other. And if you wanted to close your eyes and go back to that crossroads, and you could see the chapel on one side and the well on the other, what if you saw the chapel light up with streaming light, and you heard singing and joy coming from the chapel? And what if you smelled the perfumed flowers and the trees surrounding the well and heard the gurgle of the waters? And you said, I'm here where they come together, confluence. And I held that vision for a long time until I finally realized that I was not seeing the three. I was not seeing that if you have a confluence, you have a vesica piscis, where you have one and the other, but in the middle, there's a sacred space. And in that sacred space is Awen. And in that sacred space is the way we go forward into a new and changed world. So that's it.
– Thank you so much, Roma. And there's lots of questions. It's just interesting when you asked us to do that. Imagine being on a roadway and seeing the church on one side. I couldn't see a road because so many of old churches in Ireland have wells with trees around them.
Mm.
And very much, we have this expression, fitcha fucha, things are very much entwined.
Yeah.
And then I came back to it again at the last minute. I thought, okay, they're one, which is which is your conclusion, which is around the confluence and that meeting of both.
Yeah.
Now, Tricia has a question. Okay, the first one Philip asked, I assume you were talking about Pelagius.
Pelagius, yeah.
Who, bless him, he was hounded by Saint Augustine, who caught up with him in Jerusalem. And anyway, he was convicted as a heretic, bless him.
Well, he was never convicted as a heretic, actually. He was brought before 3 separate councils. You see, you can see it in his writing. He was arguing against original sin. We were not born sinful and horrible and lost and broken. He was arguing against that, saying, how can you look at a baby and look in a baby's face and not see the image of God? And so Augustine wasn't having it. So he brought him to 3 different councils, and each one of the councils exonerated him and said, no, he's not a heretic. So Augustine didn't really win, but he did exile him and threw him out of Jerusalem, and he could never come back and never be there.
It's really interesting, because I had assumed, okay, he didn't get back. So interesting how the 3 courts found that he wasn't a heretic, and yet the notion of original sin has survived. It's quite fascinating.
Well, it's true, but there are also a number of communities that still go by the Pelagian teachings. The one that's probably most well known is the Northumberland community, the ones that have written those 2 books called Celtic Daily Prayer, and they follow Pelagian's thinking.
Okay. Now, a question from Tricia. Is the threeness of the Trinity Christianity's response to the triads of paganism?
I don't think it's a response to, no, I don't. I think it came out of a different mindset altogether, because in paganism, the 3 are coexistent or coeval, whatever you want to say. In the history of the Trinity, it was seen that the first was the Father, then the Father incarnated as the Son. Then when the Son was resurrected, the Holy Spirit was brought in. And it wasn't like that. It just doesn't really, it looks like that on paper, but it doesn't quite work out in a faith exercise.
Can I just say, Roma, thank you so much. That was fantastic. And wasn't it Saint Hilaire who introduced the concept of the Trinity? Sometime, I was just trying to check it. I didn't have time to check.
It was 1100.
And there was there's a suggestion that he was a Druid. Who knows? But
well, they were arguing about the essence of God, and the essence, whether God was the same as Jesus, whether Jesus was in God or of God, whether Jesus was born of God or created by God, whether, all of this was going on from just about day one. And there were many different, the myth that we come down with is that there was one Christianity, that the minute Jesus died and was resurrected, that one Christian, but there were actually about 20 different Christianities. And they had many different points of view. I think probably Saint Hilaire probably brought together and codified and made into doctrine that the right answer and the final answer. That's my theory. You can.
Okay.
I think St. Patrick's success in Ireland was his use of the Trinity, that it was easy for people in Ireland already with the notion of triple deity and triads and the 3 realms to actually explain that mystery of 3 persons in one.
Well, they also had no trouble whatsoever understanding the resurrection.
Yeah.
This was not a new concept. The seed goes into the tree goes into the branch goes into the leaves go into the fruit go into the seeds, the seed. And this is, what is that? But the resurrection of the tree, so to speak. So they didn't have a problem with that. Whereas a lot of other areas where early Christian people went out, people couldn't get it. That was like a magic, some kind of a magic thing.
Now, another question from Liz Hills. Is there a particular connection between Christianity and the energies of civilization, do you think? I'm wondering if that might be a useful framework. And she has a part 2 as well. So let's
hear the part 2 for a minute.
Okay. She says there's, and I didn't know there could possibly be that many, but 40,000 plus Christian denominations. And she's saying that the Trinity is not a pan-Christian concept. So were you thinking of specific denominations, or were you thinking more universally?
Oh, I'm just thinking universally. I don't think, you can get into denominations that believe all kinds of things. I have to plug my computer in, but keep asking questions. I'm listening.
Okay, now. Wait a second. I'm just coming back into, I've taken some down, and there's a question, Roma, where can they read your writing? So we can come back to that just before we finish. Trey says, Einstein was not a Christian or believer, but through his own awe and wonder of the cosmos, he connected with the luminosity of the Nazarene through his recognition that grace and compassion were essential for the humanity. Jesus was also a heretic. So there have been claims here in the comments that, he was an Essene and also a Druid. So the Essenes were seen as more in tune with Druidry. And then Jennifer,
Just a second, I'm sorry.
did you want to respond to that?
You started talking about Einstein. What did you say?
Okay. Einstein was not a Christian or believer, but through his own awe and wonder of the cosmos, he connected with the luminosity of the Nazarene through his recognition that grace and compassion were essential for the humanity. Jesus was also a heretic.
I think that you can find people to argue on both sides of all of those. People say that by Einstein saying erroneously, of course, that God doesn't play poker or whatever he said, he still believed in a God that could or could not play poker, in these questions of the universe. So here in Princeton, we have the scientists are on the winning side. There's many scientists, we have 6,000 people on campus working on these kinds of questions. And many people here are what they call themselves confirmed atheists. And it's the same thing, though. If I teach something like this to a group of people who are confirmed atheists, they still follow me to the parking lot and say, I just wanted to ask you one little thing, They're not as confirmed as perhaps they think they are. We're all interested in this. We all want to find what's sacred in the world.
Yeah, thank God they're all atheists. So, Zoe, I he adds Dante to the confluence list. He just didn't know it of himself, I reckon. And then Sarah says, from Pelagius to Wycliffe, Lollards to Julian of Norwich, etc., and many in between, we're still trying. Absolutely. And Liz actually has given in the chat just a Wikipedia, the list of Christian denominations. That's very, very interesting. There was something from Jennifer, and then we will get into our chat rooms again. There are Christian magical spells from the Middle East in the 4th to 5th century that use a Trinitarian formula, although the parts of the Trinity are not then fixed. The part of the Holy Spirit is sometimes taken by Sophia or Mary.
Yes, absolutely. And there are some Christian, I don't know if you would call them sects, but there are some Christian sects to this day that think that Jesus represented the feminine or wisdom side of the equation. So
I just find this so fascinating. Somebody was asking your writings, where can they find your writing? Where can they read you?
romajohnson.com.
Okay. Are you all, is that the way you spell it? The way you write it, like at the big R?
It's all small letters, romajohnson.com. There's quite a few things I've written posted there.
Roma Johnson. Oh, God, I can't spell either. HN.
romajohnson.com.
Okay. So that's there. Okay, brilliant.
Philip and I wrote a book called The Seven Valleys, which is a really wonderful little.
I heard something about that.
Yeah. We wrote that together when we were in lockdown together. Two creative minds can't be put in lockdown for very long before something happens. But that's about the Sufi point of view. Yeah, the search for God in Sufi world.
Brilliant. So, Mason says, wonderful lectures today. Thank you both and everyone who shared questions and thoughts. Sadly unable to stay through the end. So what we're going to do is get you into breakout rooms again, and I'll just assign them randomly. And please feel join. I'll just do this now. I'm going to stop the recording.
But can I ask a question, Amar? Are you going to bring us back to this
I am,
main?
yeah, yeah.
Okay,
and then
afterwards?
we can do
All
a
right.
finish. Yeah.
All right,
I'll
thank you.
pause the recording now. So, welcome back, everybody, and on time. And this, I suppose, brings us to the end of the first part of the Mount Haemus, and I hope you can join us at the same time next Tuesday to hear our other two speakers. I hope you enjoy this. What I would love you to do is just put in one word to describe how this has what it's meant to you or your reaction to it.
And just to say that you'll find for those of you who aren't familiar with Zoom, it's I suddenly can't find it myself. Where's the chat buttons, Ema? For those who don't know,
it's down on the 1, 2, 3, 4. It's the fifth from the left.
Fifth from the left down the bottom. Yeah, there we go. Yeah, lovely.
So interesting.
The words are coming through. Yes.
Heartwarming, community, worldwide connection, awe, thought-provoking, inspiring, vindication. Interesting. Just wanted to say it was a pleasure to chat. Thanks to my breakout buddies. Such a great opportunity to connect and discuss all sorts. Oh, sorry, Pat. Oh, she couldn't join the breakout rooms as Pat Booker. Fergus was being a pest and barking a lot. I'll have a word with him when I meet him. Claire, James, wonderful lectures. Thank you to her. She had to leave early. Glad to have new books and reading to navigate. Connection, illuminating, not alone. I think many people will concur with that. Connection. Inspiring. Thank you so much, breakout buddies and everyone. Great to be with everyone. Awesome community connection. Iris, fascinating. Lots to ponder. Soul stirring. Yeah, absolutely. Fascinating getting used to this Zoom thing. Well, welcome to the world of Zoom. So I just say thank you all for coming and attending, and it's great because I suppose we would having it online allows far more people to attend than would, particularly our US speakers, because all our speakers this time are from the US, so saves you a flight and all of that. So it's just wonderful. Great opportunity to learn, always welcome. Fascinating, brilliant. So I will wish you all a good afternoon. You lucky Americans, I can see you're all in daylight, and then we've people from the Southern Hemisphere, and then the rest of us here, still a bit bright. So looking forward to seeing you. And of course, this is a recording, so this will this go into the hearth, Philip?
This will go into the hearth. So what we'll do is it'll appear in the Druid hearth. If you haven't had if you're a member of the order and you haven't had an invitation, you will get one. It's just taking a long time to get everybody in. But if you want to get in, send an email to office@druidry.org and saying, can I get into the hearth, please? It's an amazing new kind of community environment that we've created. It's taken 2 years to create, but we've created it. And then it'll eventually be up on YouTube as well. But it'll be in the hearth for a couple of months, and then it'll go out into YouTube. And you can get, just so you know as well, the actual what I loved about your presentations, Michelle and Roma, were that you didn't just read them out, and that you talked about them and the ideas behind them and so on. If you want to read their presentations, you'll find them in volume 3 of the Mount Haemus lectures, which is available in the Obod store. It's a great collection, and you can get them there. And thank you so much, Michelle and Roma, for presenting to us.
Oh, it was absolutely lovely. So somebody's asked is it possible to watch next week recorded? Yes.
Same thing.
Recorded, and the same thing will be on the hearth. So so Miriam, a nice bit of feedback. The hearth is absolutely great. Applause to the people creating, designing and implementing it. I had nothing to do with it, I have to tell you, but I am in awe of the team who created that and who are troubleshooting. As I speak, I assume they have been working night and day. So our patience to navigate it, because I got it, it's hard. Once you get used to it, you're fine. with all the glitches and the teething problems that we expect. So looking forward to seeing you all there. So in the meantime, I wish you all a nice evening, good morning, and whatever you're doing, if you're listening, watching a recording of this. So until next week, slán go fóill.
Okay.
Slán.
Bye, everybody. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.